I don't know if it's some kind of subconscious election fever taking hold of me, or just mere coincidence, but I seem to have made a fair few videos about football, or soccer, in the United States over the last few months. There was my video about some of the problems with US youth development, a documentary about the creation of David Beckham's Inter Miami franchise, and even a video about how the US national team could line up if everyone who was eligible to represent the United States had chosen to do so. Despite the fact that I'm not American, as you can probably tell, they were all videos that I found really interesting, and hopefully some of you did too, regardless of where you're from. The most interesting period on the football or soccer scene in the United States, though, in many respects, has to be the era of the North American Soccer League. Not the most recent NASL, which spanned from 2011 to 2017, but the one from a few decades earlier, which attracted some of the biggest names in world football and appeared to rise up and subsequently implode with almost equal speed and chaos. Whilst that is the common perception, the NASL actually had greater longevity than a lot of people seem to think, running from 1968 to 1984, so it's not quite right to think of the league as just a few years of madness. However, the period of the NASL bringing in superstars like Pele and George Best was significantly shorter, and that's probably the reason behind some of that confusion. The origin of the NASL was actually the 1966 World Cup in England. Although the US was unrepresented at the finals in England and hadn't qualified for a World Cup since 1950, the World Cup was broadcast over the pond, and the viewing figures caught many people by surprise. Over 1 million Americans tuned in, despite virtually no promotion or wider press coverage, and FIFA's documentary film entitled Goal, which was a narrated highlights package covering the finals, sold surprisingly well in the United States. This caught the attention of a number of wealthy investors who looked at the clear appetite for soccer in America, despite the lack of promotion, and wondered how a professional soccer league could perform with a bit of a push. Interestingly enough, just to give you a bit of history on US football, the US actually had one of the oldest professional football leagues on earth, and it referred to the sport as football rather than soccer. The American League of Professional Football was founded in 1894, founded by the owners of America's National League baseball teams as a way to bring in revenue during the winter months when baseball wasn't played. However, the league lasted for just a few seasons before being replaced by the semi-professional National Association Football League, which ran until 1921 when it merged with the Southern New England Soccer League to create the fully professional American Soccer League. Despite being largely forgotten now, the American Soccer League was actually hugely popular, attracting talented players from across the globe and becoming the second most popular sports league in the United States, behind Major League Baseball, but ahead of the NFL. Despite its popularity, the league collapsed in 1933 due to conflict with the sport's governing body and the onset of the Great Depression, and football, or soccer, would largely disappear from America's consciousness for the next 35 years. That was until the rise in college soccer in the early 1960s, the response to the 1966 World Cup, and the arrival of investors in light of those two events. In 1967, looking to capitalise upon the newly discovered popularity of soccer in America, two rival leagues were founded, the United Soccer Association and the National Professional Soccer League. The United Soccer Association was the one which won FIFA approval and a TV broadcasting deal, but it was still an extremely amateur operation. Not in terms of the players, who were all professional, but in terms of how it was run. The league consisted of 12 teams split into an East and West division that were entirely imported from European or South American clubs, but repackaged as representing US cities. So Wolverhampton Wanderers became the Los Angeles Wolves, Shamrock Rovers became Boston Rovers, and Stoke City became the Cleveland Stokers. The European and South American teams treated the league as a pre-season competition. There was no US representation, and the viewing figures were absolutely awful. The league lasted for just a single season, before the two rival leagues were merged to create the North American Soccer League, or NASL. The NASL's debut campaign consisted of 17 teams from both Canada and the United States, and significant investment was made. There were a number of British, Eastern European and South American players, many of whom were former internationals, often in the autumn of their careers, and the league's biggest name recruit was the 1958 and 1962 World Cup winning Brazilian centre-forward Vava. The Atlanta Chiefs became the first NASL champions, following success in the playoffs, and their player-manager, former Welsh international Phil Woosnam, was subsequently appointed as both the manager of the United States men's national team and also as the NASL's commissioner. Woosnam would have a challenge on his hands though, and not just in getting a tune out of the failing national team. The expensive stadium rentals and salaries of overseas players saw every single NASL team lose money in the 1968 season, and a number of fickle investors decided to cut their losses and pull funding after just a single season. When CBS pulled out of their broadcasting of the league's games, 12 NASL teams folded, leaving the division with a pathetic 5 teams for the 1969 campaign. A double round-robin format, once again competed by rebranded overseas clubs, attracted little interest from the public, and in 1970, the league very nearly folded just 2 years on from its creation. However, through the clever use of friendly games against intriguing overseas opponents, most notably Pele Santos, the league was able to soldier on. One more team folded, but 2 were recruited from the American Soccer League, and those 2 would face off in the 1970 NASL final. Further additions were made the following season, but crowds, broadcast deals, and investments proved hard to come by. As a result, the league remained largely semi-professional from 1969 through to 1975. There were positive signs by 1973 when the Philadelphia Atoms became the first NASL team to average over 10,000 fans across a season, with their goalkeeper, Bob Rigby, becoming the first soccer player to feature on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and the NASL final attracting a crowd of more than 18,000 people. As crowds continued to grow and CBS began to broadcast the NASL finals, more and more teams looked to buy into the league. The real transformation came in 1975 though. Boston struck first with the arrival of Benfica and Portugal legend Eusebio, but the New York Cosmos had something even bigger up their sleeve. The Cosmos were backed by Steve Ross, CEO of the Time Warner Corporation, one of the biggest media companies on earth. In 1975, Ross flexed his financial muscles by signing the world's most famous footballer, Pele. Pele had entered a state of semi-retirement 2 years earlier, although he had kept fit and continued to make sporadic appearances for Santos. The Cosmos tempted the Brazilian to come to the Big Apple with a lucrative contract, and he completely changed the face of soccer in the United States. Even people with no interest in the sport knew about Pele, and his arrival captured both US and worldwide attention. The Cosmos crowds more than doubled to over 20,000 in less than half a season, and there were more than 40,000 fans in attendance long before kickoff to see the Brazilian's much anticipated debut. His debut was also broadcast live on CBS, attracting an audience of more than 10 million people, a record for a soccer game in the United States. Pele's popularity prompted ABC to purchase the league's broadcasting rights for the 1976 season, and many more high-profile players were to follow. The Cosmos led the way with Franz Beckenbauer, Johan, Carlos Alberto Torres, and Giorgio Canaglia linking up with Pele. On the West Coast, the LA Aztecs brought in George Best, who was followed by the legendary Dutch duo of Rinus Michels on the touchline and Johan Cruyff on the pitch. Bobby Moore played for both the San Antonio Thunder and the Seattle Sounders, Ruud Krol spent time with the Vancouver Whitecaps, and Gerd Muller signed for the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, who also brought in Elias Figueroa and Gordon Banks. If you were to make World 11s for the 1960s and 70s, over half of all the players included would have played their club football in the United States at some stage. And it's a bit of a myth that they were all aging has-beens looking for one last payday. The idea that the NASL was a retirement league is one that I debunked on this channel more than 3 years ago. But since I doubt many of you have been subscribed to this channel for more than 3 years, it's one worth repeating. Giorgio Canaglia was just 29 when he arrived in the NASL. Hugo Sanchez played in the league at the age of 21, Trevor Francis spent a season on loan aged only 23, and Peter Beardsley signed for Vancouver Whitecaps when he was just 20. Even among the more experienced players, Johan Cruyff was still only 32, Pele was 34, Gerd Muller was 33, and Franz Beckenbauer was just 31. All were still among the finest players in their respective positions on earth at the time, and in their prime, the New York Cosmos would have given almost any opposition a tough game. With these star names, soccer in America continued to grow. The Cosmos began getting regular attendances in excess of 40,000, and for the 1978 NASL Final, or Soccer Bowl as it became known, 75,000 people turned out at the Giant Stadium to witness the Cosmos beat the Tampa Bay Rowdies 3-1. That remains the highest attendance for a professional soccer match in a US league of all time, and you may be starting to wonder why the division didn't kick on and become a real success. Sadly, whilst the Cosmos flourished, not all teams were blessed with such wealthy backers. As the NASL's lesser clubs looked to compete, typically bring in aging and less effective players on inflated salaries, their debts began to mount. What's more, whilst the New York Cosmos, along with a handful of other clubs, were able to draw big crowds, many were not. Some teams struggled to regularly attract more than 5,000 fans for their home games, and whilst the league's overall average attendance continued to increase right up until 1980, it peaked at just 14,440. Even more damaging was the fact that despite being picked up by CBS, TBS and ABC in terms of broadcasting rights, general viewing figures remained fairly low. Soccer was given very little billing by the broadcasters and by American newspapers and broader media, which meant growing the sport and the NASL's audience always felt like an uphill battle. By 1980, on average, 70% of the NASL's revenue was going straight into players' salaries, compared to just 40% in the far more lucrative NFL at the same time. It was unsustainable, and the growth wasn't significant enough to justify the premium. By 1980, the league was running a $30 million deficit, and not a single team recorded a profit that season. The league was facing competition from America's increasingly popular indoor soccer leagues, and then came the most severe US recession since World War II. The 1979 oil crisis and a 1980 increase in the federal funds rate led to a reduction in the availability of consumer credit, with real-world consequences of a more than 10% rise in unemployment. The owners of NASL teams began to get nervous, finding it increasingly difficult to justify their sustained losses, and by 1981, teams started to fall by the wayside. The loss of 7 teams led the NASL Commission to become very lax with its league admission policy in order to return the league to its full complement, and in came directors with very little understanding of the sport. Poor players were recruited, attendances dwindled, and debts mounted. Franchises departed as rapidly as they had arrived, and by 1982, the league's average attendance fell to 13,155, and for the first time since 1973, the league could only attract local, rather than nationwide, broadcasting deals. A failed bid to host the 1986 World Cup, and the success of the major indoor soccer league in poaching a number of the NASL's teams, was the final nail in the league's coffin. Chicago Sting won the final Soccer Bowl crown in 1984, but only 9 teams were left by that time, and the division suspended operations in 1985. Although the NASL is widely viewed in much of the world as a failure and a bit of a circus, and there is some truth to both of those claims, it also deserves a great deal of credit. The NASL brought soccer back into America's consciousness, and the US would go on to host the 1994 World Cup, leading to another spike in the popularity of the sport and the creation of the MLS in 1996. The MLS itself learnt a great deal from the successes and failures of the NASL, and has become a much more sustainable enterprise as a result of those lessons. The MLS's strict financial framework, relaxed a little over the last 10 to 15 years, but still far more rigid than most nations' leagues, is primarily a safeguard against financial recklessness. Meanwhile, the MLS also faces many of the same challenges that the NASL did, most notably in terms of stealing column inches and TV viewership from America's more established sports like baseball, basketball, and American football. The NASL also gave the world, not just the US, a great deal of innovation. Whilst the suggestion of expanding the goal size to increase the number of goals, and the replacement of traditional football clocks with ones that counted down like other US sports were mocked by much of the world, America gets very little credit for the ideas that they implemented, which were actually adopted. The NASL was the first major league, for example, to outlaw the back pass, meaning teams could no longer waste time by passing the ball back to their goalkeeper for him to pick the ball up, something which is now a universal within the laws of the game. The NASL also implemented fixed shirt numbers throughout the season so that fans knew who was who by their shirt numbers, rather than the starting 11 wearing a 1-11 which corresponded with their position. For the same reason, the NASL became the first league that required players' names to be printed on the back of their shirts, something that many other competitions took decades to catch up to. Other ideas that weren't universally adopted include the 35-yard line, designed to give attacking players more time and space, and reduce the number of offside calls, the banning of draws, and a rather unique point system. While some of the NASL's innovations were a bit daft and made the league appear as something of a novelty, we ought to look back with a balanced perspective. The division's point system was absolute lunacy, especially the fact that it changed so wildly from one season to the next. So a penalty win one season could be worth 6 points, then 4, then 1, and then 6 again, seemingly with little justification. The replacement for traditional penalties themselves, however, with the system of a player dribbling the ball from the 35-yard line and having 5 seconds to try and beat the goalkeeper, I'm just going to come out and say it, was better than actual penalties. They were brilliant to watch and actually tested far more of a player's talents than a traditional 12-yard shootout. One other major problem with the league was the lack of consideration for homegrown players, who always appeared to be an afterthought. Little time or thought was given to youth development or having US representatives in the best teams, and the national team suffered as a consequence. For that reason, despite the fact that some of the best paid players on earth played in the United States in the late 1970s, the USMNT couldn't even qualify for the CONCACAF Championship, losing 3-0 to Canada in qualification, never mind the World Cup. The NASL attempted to rectify this with the creation of Team America, and no, I'm not referring to the animated movie made by the South Park creators, but an NASL team which was supposed to be the entire US national team. Needless to say that it was an absolute disaster, but that will have to be another video for another day given the length of this video at present. Ultimately, the NASL was a failure in financial terms, but not necessarily in footballing terms. Teams spent beyond their means and looked for immediate solutions to long-term problems, which led to their subsequent demise. However, out of their demise, the MLS was born, and a new era for both the USMNT and soccer in the United States in general sprang up. What's more, football itself, across the globe, gained in a number of interesting ways from the sometimes brilliant and sometimes mental innovations of the sport in North America. It's difficult to know what soccer would look like in the United States now without the NASL, but it's quite possible it would be all but down and out. Instead, more than 25 million people play soccer across the United States, soccer is the third most watched sport on TV in America, and the USMNT have a handful of really talented young players who are building an exciting era for American fans of the sport. The NASL was a failure, but it was a glorious failure, and soccer in the United States, in particular, owes an awful lot to it. So that's it for today's video. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it quite interesting to research, and write about at least, but do give the video a like if you found any joy or knowledge within it. Feel free to leave any thoughts down below in the comments section, double check to make sure that you're subscribed to the finest YouTube channel on all the earth, and if you'd like to follow me on social media, the username to do so is @HITC Sevens on both Twitter and Instagram.